This is a Q13 News special report, The Last Generation.
The southern resident orcas, an icon in the Puget Sound. The fish-eating killer whales that have called these waters home for tens of thousands of years. And then we showed up. We overharvested their prey. We dammed the salmon runs. We polluted their waters, both with toxins and noise. We captured their young and shipped them off to marine parks. And still they survived until now. Now they're at a breaking point. And they probably know it. They know they're hungry. They're spread out looking for food far more than they find it. And they know their babies are dying. Tahlequah certainly did. She carried her dead calf on her head for 17 days and 1,000 miles. She showed the world her pain. These resident orcas with tight family bonds and deep emotional intelligence, a population down to 75 whales, when it's believed historically more than 200 swam these waters. I've spent the past year analyzing this question. Is this the last generation of southern resident orcas? I've looked at the threats to their survival, the lack of prey, the contaminants, the vessel disturbance. I've interviewed the foremost experts in this field and pressed the people who have the power to make a change. I've traveled across this state and even to Canada learning about solutions and meeting the people who are pushing them forward. A year later, I've come to a conclusion, and it's one I don't make lightly. I'm dropping the question mark. There is no question. This is the last generation. If humans fail to act now, to turn it around. But don't take it from me. I'm just a journalist.
You're the expert. Is this the last generation?
Yes.
That's Ken Balcom. He's studied and counted these orcas for the federal government for more than 4 decades. He's one of many voices you'll hear from this hour as we investigate what's plaguing this treasured population. The governor is another.
The Tahlequah story touched every mother and father because we saw ourselves in her pain. But it is something you don't want to forget. And you need that memory sometimes to spur you to action. And we're asking people in Washington to take action. It reminds me to take action.
Along with the tribes.
Finally, people seem to be paying some attention. Because after the killer whale's gone, we'll be gone. And people need to know that.
And you and I are about to explore how far people are willing to go to save the southern residents. I'm Simone Del Rosario, and this is The Last Generation.
If we want to keep them around, we got to do something fast.
A call to action from Ken Balcom, a leading researcher on the southern resident killer whales. It's a warning we've heard before.
We are in critical danger of losing these orcas altogether.
That was 6 years ago when Q13 News put a spotlight on this species on the brink of extinction.
Could it happen? That's the wrong question. Is it happening? It's happening right now. Could we stop it? Maybe.
Since these interviews, the southern resident population is down 7 more whales, a problem that's plagued it for much longer.
I've been telling this story for 20 years.
And it's only getting worse.
The southern residents are not a very healthy population right now.
Lynn Berry studies marine mammals for NOAA. She believes these orcas face 3 main threats, the same 3 threats they've been talking about for years. A shortage of Chinook salmon, the mammal's main prey, pollution in the water, and boat noise. In your opinion, is there one that's bigger than the rest?
All the threats are combined.
Without abundant salmon, the southern residents are starving. When they can't eat, they access their fat storage, which is full of contaminants. And with boat noise, they have a harder time using echolocation to find what little salmon there is.
Would you agree that it's these 3?
No, I disagree. It's a divide and conquer strategy. First of all, in biology, there's a principle of parsimony.
The idea that the most acceptable solution is the simplest.
You can add these other things, but the simplest is the food. And then triage, what are you going to treat first? The food. That's the one that's going to solve the problem.
Well, our recovery program has always been a comprehensive one, and we want to go after all the threats.
But the population is not recovering. Increased salmon hatcheries, voluntary no-go zones, habitat restoration, these have not resulted in more whales. While experts don't always agree on the approach, they do agree on this.
If we don't save the orca, then we will have let down future generations.
Stephanie Solene co-chairs Governor Jay Inslee's task force to save the southern residents. Last March, the governor signed the executive order to form the group.
Do I wish that there had been more political will and more action taken 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago? I absolutely do. And there were a lot of people sending those messages.
And the orcas are sending them too, from Tahlequah's tour of grief to wasting away before our eyes. The southern residents lost 3 whales in 2018, and researchers are still reeling. The year started with hope that help was on the way.
It commits the state of Washington to real action for real recovery for our real treasure.
An executive order on orca recovery and a team tasked with proposing life-saving solutions for southern residents.
Nobody is on this task force to talk. We're on this task force to take action to help the orca.
But as they talked about what action to take,
researchers say an orca in our region is missing and presumed dead. Cruiser went missing from his pod a couple of months ago.
Let's take a look at what this crisis looks like right now. These photos were taken yesterday. This is a mother swimming with her stillborn calf balancing on her head. J35, or Tahlequah, the mother, is still carrying her dead calf. And it's something she's done now for 16 days. Another photo that is coming out right now of a young 4-year-old that is starving.
Hopefully something can be done, because this has been heartbreaking to watch.
Teams from the United States and from Canada have taken unprecedented action to medicate J50 in the wild using DART injections.
We begin today with breaking news. Lead researchers have determined that J50, the sick orca calf, is dead.
3 orcas dead in as many months. For scientists, it was a summer of stress and sorrow.
I didn't realize how stressed and really depressed I was until it was over.
Tahlequah's tragedy took the biggest toll. For 17 days and more than 1,000 miles, she carried her dead calf on her head.
I felt like I had to document it every day, but I felt like I was some sort of messenger of doom.
Day after day on the water, researchers left cursing and crying.
There were tears from me, and just, you know, just kind of that nauseous feeling you get when you're just watching something you didn't ever want to watch.
And as soon as the relief swept over them when they spotted her without her dead calf, worry set in for the endeared 3-year-old Scarlet, wasting away. Spurred by public interest after Tahlequah, the federal government took unprecedented action to save Scarlet. But it didn't work.
JK&L pods are out there, and J50 is not with them. How's that? She's dead.
And frustration set in. Down to 75 whales, time is running out.
We need to see growth. We need to see better reproduction.
And we need to see a commitment from the people of Washington to make it happen.
And from this moment on.
Well, after an unimaginable year, 2019 brings hope with the birth of a new calf. This little one here, L124, was spotted for the first time shortly after the new year. Balcom is calling it lucky for now, and he hopes it is. 40% of southern resident calves don't survive the first few years. But it's doing well through the first few months. Just this week, it was spotted again, all the way down in Monterey Bay, California. Monterey Bay Whale Watch found L-pod foraging down there. It's the first time the calf has been documented in 2.5 months. L124 has been described as frisky, energetic, and most importantly, healthy. The same can't be said for 2 other orcas, K25 and J17. Now, K25 has shown dramatic weight loss since the loss of his mother. Researchers calling it a warning sign. They've asked boaters to keep their distance. While J17, Tahlequah's mother, she started showing peanut head in December. It's a sign of starvation when areas around their head, which should be full of fat, sink in. It was a telltale sign when J50's death was imminent, and J17 is now showing it too. This is what Balcom told me just a few weeks ago.
Well, I don't think there's a very good chance we'll see J17 again. K25 we might. He wasn't quite as bad. But if J17 comes back, that'll be one of these miracles.
Well, one of those miracles happened. J17 did come back a couple of weeks ago and looked a little healthier than when she left. Researchers are keeping a close eye on her and K25, and they're ready to get health samples if given the chance. All the while hoping this year is better than the last. Well, coming up, Governor Jay Inslee's ambitious plans to save the southern residents.
I'm the governor who is the one who organized this effort, and I've been fighting for this for several years and will continue to do so.
Next, we'll dive into the task force he created and the suggestions that they believe could become solutions for the endangered species. And later, it's arguably the most controversial solution, breaching local dams. How it could provide more salmon for the orcas, but also cause people to lose their jobs. It's been about 1 year since Governor Jay Inslee put pen to paper, signing an executive order to form a task force to save our southern residents. It was a tall order then, and as we watch the population continue to suffer through the summer, there's one word that truly describes what the task force was doing. It was timely. We followed the task force and its progress throughout the year and the state, attending meetings in Lacey, Wenatchee, Anacortes, and Tacoma. And I asked tough questions to those tasked with making a real impact.
I think there's a myth that this is an impossible task.
The governor setting the bar at bold actions.
We're going to make them as bold as we can.
For task force members with wide-ranging priorities, from orca and salmon scientists to tribes to farmers, fishermen, politicians, and more. There's a lot of different interests going on. It's a very diverse group. They're hoping that by putting everyone into the room, they're going to be able to come up with something that the state legislator will get behind, because that's a diverse group of people too.
And hopefully find a real solution.
Science-based solutions, with expert working groups focused on the 3 threats to whales: vessel noise, contaminants, and prey availability.
We've got all the science we need. We got to make some political decisions that are tough.
With stakeholders at odds with what that looked like, the public started applying pressure. With protests, public comment,
I think that we all know the things that we need to do and how urgent it is.
And petitions.
I'm personally honored to be able to receive these petitions and to hear the concerns that have been identified. We share those concerns.
And I took those concerns straight to the top. These measures that this task force is taking, I've been reading the reports, going through what sort of measures are being taken. All of that is going to be great for the long term and for the overall health of the Salish Sea. But really what these orca need are food, and we need more than just hatchery salmon. We need to find out how to restore the wild Chinook salmon so that we aren't having to artificially feed these whales year after year. So if the science points to breaching dams, do you have what it takes to go up against tough bodies like Bonneville Power to make that happen?
I've had a long-term career, and I have never been afraid of a good challenge to do the right thing. But again, we need to work on improving the habitat throughout our system, not just the Columbia River. As the report came out 2 days ago, that these Chinook from urban rivers right in the central core of Puget Sound are very important to the orcas. We need to improve that habitat as well. And yes, I am. Look, I'm the governor who is the one who organized this effort, and I've been fighting for this for several years and will continue to do so. I believe it's central to who we are as Washingtonians, and I'm going to do that heavy lift, you bet.
Their mission, critical, as 3 orcas died that summer. These recommended actions could be the difference between survival and extinction. It must be hard to be working behind the scenes and see these deaths, but also my question is this task force moving fast enough to save this species?
Well, I guess what I would say is that how timely this work is. And of course, the challenge that we've had is one that's been for decades in regard to the issues around the effects of contaminants in the sound, and food for the orcas themselves. And we never would have imagined that it would play out so clearly the critical importance of being able to begin to take steps that effectively can make a difference.
Is anything we're looking at perfect? No.
But during the process, even some task force members doubted the recommendations would do that.
The salmon habitat issue is not as strong as I would like to see it. The reality is the orcas are starving to death.
Months of meetings came down to this ballroom in Tacoma, where members struggled to come to a consensus, deciding which recommendations would make the final cut.
Everyone has different ideas of what are bold, but what we have in there now, we know will make a difference.
But will it be enough to ensure future generations of orcas?
How do we know if they succeed, if we can say this was a win for everyone?
That's a great question. I asked them today, what does that look like? They want to see 10 orcas added to this population in the next 10 years. But no sooner did those recommendations come out that experts started casting doubt.
Good, but not bold. This set of recommendations on their own is not going to be enough to meet that goal of 10 new whales in 10 years.
And Rob, who served as an expert on a task force working group, is not the only one who thinks that. But the work is not yet done. It's on to year 2 now. The group met for the first time in 2019, this past month. I was there at the meeting as they broke down what this next phase looks like. Now, there's still a lot of loose ends to tie up from last year, including seeing a lot of those recommendations come to fruition. But they're already setting their sights on even loftier goals, like tackling climate change. Here in Washington state, climate change means the temperatures are getting warmer, the rain is getting heavier, there's less snow and it's melting earlier, and the sea level, it's rising. All of this will cause widespread changes to salmon habitat, making it harder for salmon to survive and exacerbating the orca's main problem, their lack of food.
If we don't start preserving the environment today with the money we have today, it's going to cost Washington state and the nation millions of dollars, billions of dollars down the road to clean up what we've left behind. We can't just kick the can down the road when the orcas are gone and wait for us to be next.
I think Washingtonians have heard that message. It was a message sent to us by the orca that their survival depends on us.
The governor asked for $1.1 billion in his budget to spend on orca recovery the next 2 years. The lion's share of that going toward restoring salmon habitat that we've spent years destroying. As the legislature works out its budgets, it's likely the governor will get just a fraction of what he's asking for. It was a big ask in a state with a lot of other funding priorities.
The unfortunate thing is that whether the Chinook survive and thrive, whether the killer whales survive and thrive, isn't negotiable. When they don't have enough to eat, we can't go to them and say, well, this session we have $50 million. I know it's going to take $100 million to create the food for you. Is that okay?
Coming up, a look at the bills that task force created and whether they have the teeth to make a difference.
It's a big, heavy lift to get these bills into place, into law. And part of the process is compromise. It's negotiation.
How the proposed laws could impact where both recreational boaters and whale watchers can go in local waters. Out of the governor's Orca Task Force work came 3 pieces of legislation that covered a number of recommendations. These bills will change and create laws aimed at protecting the orca, its habitat, and prey. The first gives the southern residents more space on the water by keeping boats at bay. The task force and governor proposed suspending whale watching around southern residents. They also asked to double the current no-go zone around them from 200 to 400 yards. Legislators scrapped the suspension and split the difference on that protective bubble, settling at 300 yards. It's a compromise that didn't sit well with some.
I've gotten some real negative email and voicemails about not holding firm on that moratorium, about changing the protective bubble of no-go zone.
But a compromise, Austin says, that helped keep the bill alive and with bipartisan support.
It's a big, heavy lift to get these bills into place, into law. And part of the process is compromise. It's negotiation. We don't necessarily come out with a perfectly drafted bill that's going to get to everything, but we do our best.
Still holding strong, a slow speed zone within a half nautical mile of the whales, and directing the state to start licensing and regulating the currently unregulated whale watch industry. It's an industry that's on board with these changes.
One of the aspects of the vessel bill that we're most pleased with and most excited about in terms of quieting the waters for the southern residents is the slow speed zone for all boaters.
The next piece of legislation deals with safely moving oil amongst orcas. Recent history shows us what an oil spill can do. The killer whale pods caught in the Exxon Valdez oil spill are still devastated 30 years later. One pod now functionally extinct. To keep it from happening here, this legislation requires more oil tankers in Washington to have tug escorts through orca habitat. The final bill mainly focuses on our shorelines, shoreline armoring, like bulkheads. It can cause significant harm to fish life. It removes that habitat for forage fish to spawn, and Chinook salmon need that forage fish to eat. This bill gives the Department of Fish and Wildlife authority to serve stop work orders for shoreline projects that violate the rules, even on private property. It also increases civil penalties when those projects are not to code, up to $10,000 for each violation.
And for the people who say, well, this is my property and I should be able to do what I want on it.
If you're building a seawall onto a public resource, which is a forage fish bed, that is a problem for everybody. So I mean, I would just come back and say this is a shared resource. Our salmon, our birds, our seals, our orcas all depend on this habitat. We need to take care of it.
They can legislate away, but can they fund it? If the Department of Fish and Wildlife is not fully funded first, it could struggle to find the resources to enforce any new rules. The battle over budget will be a big part of any legislative story. Coming up, could the first step to saving our orcas be breaching dams? Hundreds of thousands of people seem to think so, but it comes with controversy.
Breach the dams? It's not difficult.
It would devastate it. I mean, it would basically end my livelihood.
Next, how many Chinook salmon die through the dams before ever reaching the Columbia River? Plus, the boat noise that's making it even harder to find the fish that are left. What's being done to limit the loud waterways, and what will make it worse? It is the most talked about action item during public comment at any Southern Resident Orca Task Force meeting. While there's no one solution to saving the orcas from extinction, hundreds of thousands of people have signed petitions telling government where they'd like it to start. That's by breaching 4 dams along the Lower Snake River in eastern Washington. Southern resident killer whales are starving in the Salish Sea. There's simply not enough Chinook salmon, the whale's primary food source. Some believe the answer is 300 miles away. A rallying cry to free the snake.
Breach the dams? It's not difficult.
The dams are 4 massive structures along the Lower Snake River in eastern Washington. In them, orca champions see the death of crucial salmon habitat.
Damming those rivers up and preventing access to their spawning grounds was the coup de grace for Chinook salmon.
Without them, some in eastern Washington say their way of life could wash away.
It would devastate it. I mean, it would basically end my livelihood.
The Columbia Snake River system is a 465-mile river highway that makes Lewiston, Idaho, a seaport. In 2014, nearly 10% of all U.S. wheat exports moved on barges through the Snake River dams.
We feed the world in the Pacific Northwest, and I think it's really important for those farmers to keep the dams and keep their river highway.
The dams also turn out about 5% of power needed in the Pacific Northwest. The surplus hydropower is sold out of the region to states like California. Bonneville Power Administration markets that energy, an agency currently strapped because of new renewable energy sources and a boom in natural gas, which keep prices low and competition for customers high.
There is no comparable source of firm, reliable power available that delivers the same value at anywhere near the cost of the federal Columbia River hydroelectricity system.
But that system is home to 13 species of salmon and steelhead listed under the Endangered Species Act, a federal mandate to protect and recover. The 4 dams on the lower Snake River have been in the crosshairs of salmon advocates for years.
I think that removing the 4 lower Snake River dams is the most beneficial thing we can do to protect salmon from extinction.
The plight of the orcas has invigorated the cause. Last summer, NOAA Fisheries ranked the most important Chinook stocks for the critically endangered orca. 5 of the top 10 come from the Columbia and Snake Rivers, the same rivers that serve as the largest provider for power in the Pacific Northwest.
There is a balance. Dams and fish can coexist.
The dams have proved detrimental to fish passage. The federal government has poured in billions to improve it. At Ice Harbor Dam, project manager Tim Roberts shows me the results. A fish ladder, a roughly 24-hour climb for adult fish heading upstream to spawn. A bypass to cut off juvenile fish headed straight for the turbines.
So you can hear the water coming in there. So the fish would be diverted into this slot. And so it just eventually takes them around and bypasses them around the structure.
And new turbines being installed for the fish that do slip through.
What makes it good for the fish?
It's distributing the pressure across the entire blade so there's not pockets of high pressure and low pressure the fish would be subjected to.
Is the Ice Harbor Dam doing enough to preserve the endangered fish that are in this system?
Yeah, you bet. We've, over the last 20 years that I've worked for the Corps, we've continued to make improvements throughout those 20 years.
But is it enough? I analyzed the most recent data from the Army Corps of Engineers on juvenile Chinook survival through each of the 4 lower Snake River dams, only taking into account the danger of passing each dam. My analysis showed 29% of sub-yearling Chinook will die before reaching the Columbia River. That's mostly fall Chinook, the 5th highest priority stock for orca, according to NOAA. Yearling Chinook, mainly spring stock, lost just 13% through the first 4 dams.
The other mortality, though, that's just as significant and maybe more, is the reservoir mortality due to predation, temperature, and gas.
Jim Waddell is a retired civil engineer who worked for the Army Corps when they considered breaching the dams about 20 years ago.
We're in a situation now where it's so dire, we're saying you got to breach 2 dams starting, this winter construction season.
Waddell says it's possible. The Corps says otherwise.
So point blank, could this facility be shut down this year?
No.
It's a fight that will most likely drag out in court. A federal judge ordered the dam managers to look at the environmental impacts of these structures and again, consider the benefits of breaching. It's a study that will cost around $81 million. The final report due in 2020, a decision dam breaching advocates believe will come too late to save the orca.
We've got maybe at most 5 more years of reproductive life in this population to make it happen. And if we don't do it in that 5 years, it isn't going to happen.
And even if that decision does go their way, they'll still have Congress to overcome.
I think there's way more benefit than there is deficit from having the dams in place. And I think the investments we have made in mitigating for the presence of the dams have been very successful.
So will you fight it?
I will.
There is a balance.
Congressman Dan Newhouse and Congresswoman Kathy McMorris Rodgers are 2 prominent voices against dam breaching. The dams are in their districts, and as this is a federal decision, they have a lot of say. The real determination, though, comes down to that court-ordered environmental impact statement, or EIS. It's similar to the study that was done about 20 years ago. That study found dam breaching had the highest probability of fish recovery, but the Corps instead opted to make major dam improvements, in part because that option had minimal economic impacts, especially for those who use the river to get their product to market. But the economic landscape is changing. Since the start of that first study in 1995, total tonnage shipped on the Snake River has dropped 50%. But that fact doesn't matter for the wheat growers who still rely on it, touting cheap transportation costs and fewer trucks on the road.
I do think the people that are like, dam, let's take them down. I'm not sure, are you listening? Are you wanting to listen?
The federal agency studying the issue will take these voices into account, just like it did the last time. I sat down with recently retired Army Corps fish biologist Chris Penny. He worked on the original study and was part of this current analysis before retiring.
To you, what was the purpose of the judge's request for this EIS?
Oh, to take a hard look at fish effects, you know, and for a range of alternatives that includes breaching.
And is it doing that?
I think ultimately it's not going to do that. No, I think it'll be status quo. I think it'll be keep studying it and delaying.
Until when?
Or hatchery fish, until you don't have any wild fish left or you don't have any fish.
The Army Corps of Engineers assured me the agencies are analyzing breaching as an alternative, in part because the court ordered it, but also because of the robust public input that made it clear people want this to be considered. We should see the draft report next February. Now, closer to home, there's about $500 million worth of Army Corps projects that Congress already authorized that'll help fish passage and habitat. But over the 2 years, the agency has received less than 1% of the funding needed to make it happen. These projects sit there, shovel ready, like dozens of others in the Puget Sound. From lower rivers to estuaries to shorelines, Long Live the King's Jock White tells me things here could be a lot better.
In the Snake River dams, what they think is a crisis in terms of spring Chinook recovery or survival is a smolt to adult ratio of about 1.4.
Which is less than recovery levels.
Correct. So that's a problem for them. But our smolt to adult ratios here in Puget Sound for Chinook, whether it's hatchery fish or wild fish, is about 0.4 to 0.6. So it's about half of what they're seeing or less. So we have a real crisis here too. Some of the things that we need to do here are to address some of the problems on our shorelines, to address some of the problems with our hatcheries, to address some of the challenges we have with predators in the environment, and to address some problems we have with contamination in our lower rivers and our bays.
It's a laundry list.
Yeah, it is. It really is.
We're walking here on the shoreline of Alki Point. We see the seawall here. We see, you know, the big rocks and homes built right up to the water. What concerns you about the structures that we have here in our shorelines?
Yeah, well, so here in Puget Sound, we have about 700 miles of this shoreline armoring that we see behind us here. This is a problem because if it's built right on top of where forage fish, or the main food resource for salmon and seals and other animals, are spawning, then those fish won't be successful and we'll have less food in the environment for our salmon, for our seals, and for birds and other animals. Like if you look down the beach that way, you can see that there's very coarse sediment, and in fact the water is already up to the seawall. That's right on top of where forage fish would be spawning, and so that's no longer good habitat for forage fish.
And how much of the Puget Sound looks like that?
About a third of it.
Coming up, a classic hobby for many of us in the Puget Sound that could be putting the whales in danger.
But then those whales showed up right where that boat would have been if they didn't change direction.
What's being done to give resident orcas the room they need while not taking too much away from boaters? Plus, how the local waters are poisoning the southern residents and what you can do in your everyday life to help. It looks pretty peaceful, but Puget Sound is a noisy place. Very noisy. And that sound travels faster, louder, and farther in the water than in the air. Scott Veers is the coordinator for the Orca Sound Hydrophone Network.
That's that clickety-clackety sound.
A hydrophone is an underwater microphone. And we humans started listening to Puget Sound for whale calls on dark and foggy days when they couldn't find them visually. But quickly discovered that wasn't the only show in town.
We found that ships were really dominating the soundscape, and the noise from ships was present most of the day.
That's a big problem for the southern resident killer whale that hunts fish with sound.
They sound out a click through their forehead and expect it to bounce off of a Chinook 10, maybe 50 or 100 feet away, and then listen to the echo from that little fish.
And from 20 to 30 giant container ships that enter Puget Sound daily to the more regular ferries that go back and forth.
That's that clickety-clackety sound.
Many make noise louder and at the same pitch whales use to hunt.
If there were abundant salmon, which we wish there were here in Washington, the noise might not be a big issue. But when salmon is scarce, which they are currently, particularly the Chinook salmon that the killer whales love, noise is probably quite important.
And noise is something the southern resident orcas, they can't escape. They are surrounded by container ships, oil tankers, ferries, whale watchers, private boaters, fishermen, you name it. The waters are busy and they're loud, as you just heard. And it could get worse. First Nations and tribes have been at the forefront of the fight against expanding the Trans Mountain oil pipeline from Alberta to the coast. In fact, Washington tribes traveled to Canada to testify on behalf of the orcas. Canada's National Energy Board found that the increase in marine traffic from the proposed expansion would harm the endangered southern resident orcas, significantly increase greenhouse gas emissions, and in a worst-case scenario, an oil spill would threaten the environment and the orcas' lives. Still, they approved it, saying it's in the public's best interest. The project will triple the amount of oil Canada can ship each day. But neither affected coastal region, British Columbia or Washington, are on board.
The state of Washington stands with, I believe, the people of British Columbia expressing concerns about this project.
I understand the concerns of Indigenous communities south of the border, and I understand intimately the concerns of those above the border. But that border, as I said, means nothing when it comes to the catastrophic consequences of a diluted bitumen spill in our marine environment, which is a shared environment.
Now, oil spills are catastrophic, but also a worst-case scenario. The everyday impact is going to be noise. In its report, the NEB admitted that yes, oil tankers would make it noisier for the whales, but they think we should be looking instead at ferries and whale watch boats. Of course, that's already the case. Let's take a look at ferries. The back and forth trips every day do create constant noise, and the governor wants to spend more than $100 million to build 2 new battery-powered ferries and convert 2 others to electric. And while getting ferries off diesel is a good thing, none of those 4 ferries would operate in the San Juan Islands, where the orcas are most frequently near ferries. The whale watch industry is facing changes as well. Now, they won't be banned from watching southern residents. I'm told not a single Washington legislator would support a suspension. But new legislation would still scoot them back another 100 yards and could regulate how many boats are around a group of residents at any given time. I recently went on a whale watch tour with the president of the Pacific Whale Watch Association and asked him why they fought so hard against a suspension. Given their really precarious state, why not just leave them be, if you will?
Well, I think there are some risks of us not being there, and I think we lose some value of us not being able to connect people with their story.
We probably should just be leaving them alone, to be honest, but I think it's also important to raise awareness, and I think when you do put a face to an animal, it then impacts you a bit more.
Hundreds of thousands of people each year go whale watching in the Pacific Northwest. The whale watch fleet has multiplied over decades, but actually, it's the recreational boaters that are a bigger problem in the Sound. They consistently break more rules around the southern residents than any other group on the water. In fact, enforcement tells me it's usually the whale watchers who are the role models on the water, showing other boats by example what a safe distance is and encouraging them to slow down. Now, while the state looks to create new laws on the water, the ability to enforce those laws is a real issue. You're about to see why with your own eyes.
Hi, how are you guys doing?
It's a conversation Taylor Shed has hundreds of times each summer.
We're Sound Watch, part of the Whale Museum here on San Juan Island, and we're just out here doing boater education. Just wanted to let you know that there are some actual transient whales right here in front of you.
Reaching thousands of recreational boaters with this message.
So I'm sure you guys are familiar with the regulations. It's 200 yards around, 400 in front, and we're asking that for a guideline that we stay under 7 knots within a half mile of the whales.
But in 2017, Soundwatch data shows just 31% of recreational boaters knew the rules.
What is either the rule or protocol around how close a recreational boater can get? Perfect. I have a brochure for you to have here. Yes.
That brochure contains this map and a list of Be Whale Wise guidelines. But most of it, including slow speed zones, are merely suggestions.
How you guys doing? Good? Nope.
And not everybody wants to hear it.
We're not enforcement. I can't ask people to stop what you're doing, kind of thing. We can only do education.
And run interference.
Be careful, I'm going to get this boat.
When boaters cut through the bubble of whale watch boats and right over the backs of whales, sometimes forcing Sound Watch into the bubble to cut them off.
All I have to do is turn broadside and show them that it says Sound Watch and see the flags, and then he turned. And he's not going to talk to us.
But he turned just in time.
Sound Watch shut down.
As 2 humpback whales come to the surface.
But then those whales showed up right where that boat would have been if they didn't change direction. So, that's what we do, is we mitigate risk away from the whales.
That risk is much greater when enforcement is not around. Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife polices the waters, but incidents against whales spike across all vessel types when they are not on scene. The biggest change in behavior comes from recreational boats and Canadian whale watch boats.
There are major gaps that we need to try and fill.
Russ Mullins is a sergeant with WDFW. On a typical summer day, they have 1 boat out patrolling roughly 8 hours, but a day watching whales can last twice as long.
We need to be aggressive at this point, and more enforcement assets on the water are very important, because it's like the trooper in the median. Even people that aren't speeding still have a tendency to slow down.
But more enforcement and education takes more funding for WDFW and for Sound Watch. It's a point Mullins communicates to the governor's Orca task force members he has on board. The task force recommended stronger boater rules to keep southern residents safe.
My concern is that these actions and all these resources are being put into reinventing the wheel, when a lot of that already exists and is already being educated.
Educated, but not enforced.
They are guidelines, so you're right, they're not enforceable. If they were to become law, then they could be enforceable, which would be much better.
But only if they have the resources to do it. Still ahead, poison in our local waters is hurting our southern residents.
If we change our individual actions, hopefully we'll get around to changing society.
Some of the simple changes you can make in your everyday life that will help save the dying species. We've talked extensively about 2 of the 3 main threats to southern resident killer whales: lack of food and vessel disturbance. It's the 3rd threat, pollution, that often goes overlooked. But we learned from experts that while pollution may be the hardest problem to solve, it's actually the one where you can help the orcas in your everyday life. Look at the Sound on any sunny day, and you might think it's one of the cleanest waterways in the world. But anybody who's lived here long enough could tell you different. From municipal and Navy sewage,
any leakage in the Puget Sound on us that is not authorized is unacceptable,
to stormwater and how we wash our cars, it all makes its way to the place the southern residents call home. Materials that hurt the orcas are classified as POPs, persistent organic pollutants. These chemicals do not break down easily, and they get stored in animals' fat. 3 POPs occur most commonly in southern residents. PCBs, a lubricant that was widely used in electrical equipment before being banned. PBDEs, used as flame retardants in buildings, cars, and planes. And DDTs, a pesticide that was commonly used for farming. These chemicals travel far and wide. They go into the waterways and into the fish orcas eat. Deborah Giles, an orca biologist, says the impacts to the whales are wide-ranging, from suppressing their immune systems to poisoning the unborn.
Firstborn offspring get almost 100% of the toxicants that have been stored in the mom's body through her entire life. So often those first babies don't live, and when they do live, what we're seeing, these calves are smaller than they used to be.
It's so prevalent that when an orca dies, scientists can tell which pod it came from by testing pollutants in the fat. L pod absorbs more agricultural products because they spend much of their winter off the California coast. while J-Pod, which frequents the Puget Sound more, is full of flame retardants. Giles says Washington uses more of that than neighboring states. These impacts might sound out of our control as individuals, but the chemicals that still persist come from products we use every day.
There's so many eco-friendly things that you can do.
Instead of washing your car in your driveway, go to a car wash where they filter the runoff. Same goes for changing your oil. Treating your lawn, use as few chemicals as possible. It may take policymakers to control sewage treatment plants and industrial agriculture, but
if we change our individual actions, like hopefully we'll get around to changing society.
Every little thing can help. Truly, we all play a part. Now, I've been contemplating for some time the possibility of the southern resident orcas going extinct. I wonder why we care so much about this one species. And then someone in Vancouver helped me realize what it is. The southern residents would be one of, if not the first, species to go extinct, where we know every individual by name. With those names come connections. We know each orca's story. We relate. We grieve with Tahlequah and think about what it would be like to lose our own child. Some of you know how that feels, and you empathize even more. And a 3.5-year-old orca didn't die last summer. Scarlet did, a rambunctious calf who beat the odds for years after a difficult birth. A little smaller than normal, but always spunky, putting on a show, until she was too thin and too sick to go on. The tribes say the southern resident orcas are their relatives. I marvel at that connection. And I hear from all of you on social media about how these individual orcas become a part of your family and your story. Jacqueline from Virginia adopted Joy for her daughter. They were born the same year. Vicki Doyle tells me she adopted Granny the year she became a grandmother. Allison Waters says she feels a strong connection to Onyx because he lost a parent. She relates to that. And Shannon Newell draws strength and inspiration from Tokate, who has survived nearly 5 decades in a pool at Miami Seaquarium. The pictures and the paintings behind me, those are your pictures, your memories that you sent me of seeing these magnificent mammals up close. And we want them to be here so future generations can experience that too. As a journalist, it's my job to hold those in power accountable, to ensure they are doing what it takes to save the southern residents. Preserving this species is a federal mandate. What can you do as a citizen? You can contact your state legislators as they finalize this year's budget. You can give public comment for federal and state projects. And you can keep fighting to keep these southern residents from becoming the last generation. If you'd like to learn more about our southern resident orcas, download part 1 of our Orca podcast series. It's available on Q13Fox.com or iTunes, Stitcher, or any other podcast platform. Just search Q13 News Orca Podcast.